Today we're going to look at Fujifilm's XT4. Now this camera has been out for a little while, and we do know that it can produce some excellent motion images. For example, if we will look at this one YouTuber's video channel, I think he goes by the name of Bar Paraldor, and excuse me if I just mispronounced that, but I'll put a link to his channel directly below. But this individual has been creating some absolutely gorgeous images with the XT4 and with Fuji lenses. So hopefully you don't mind me just borrowing some of your images, for this video. Now, my main question with this camera is how easy or difficult is it to incorporate into my regular production workflow? And again, I work in motion, not in stills, so we're only looking at video capabilities and we're not looking at any still photography capabilities of this camera. Autofocus is definitely an important feature with video cameras these days, and I thought I'd put the XT4 through a couple of basic tests to see where its autofocus stands. This is the most basic focus test, going back and forth between two stationary objects, high contrast objects, using the touch screen. Now, to me, it's pretty obvious that the camera is actually overshooting focus both far and near and then quickly coming back. It is fast, but it is overshooting. With the autofocus slowed down to the slowest setting, I feel that it's still overshooting the target and, snapping back. But the feel itself is very mechanical, something, again, you would expect from autofocus, not from a focus puller. With this setup, I'm testing eye detection and face tracking outdoors. Now, the big target in the background, that's there to see if I can distract the camera away from my face and my eyes. The camera's doing a pretty good job staying on my eyes. Like when I turned away, it did not snap to something crazy in the background. And of course, now when I come back in, it took a little bit of time. And of course, now I'm too close. I'm at close focus. And once I get further away, the camera does pick me up and stays with me, again, pretty well. I'm surprised how sticky the Fuji's focus is. The XT4's autofocus system really does seem to be usable in most situations. For example, if you're going to just simply pre-focus the camera before the shot, you hit the touch screen, and it's perfectly fine for that. The eye detection and face tracking, that actually seemed to work really well. Again, as long as you're not, diving off screen and the camera shoots to a far distance object and then wants to come back right away. Which leads me to the one area that I would have a lot of reservations about using the autofocus, and that's with a focus rack. If you're going touchscreen, focusing far and near, to me, it just doesn't quite cut it. It's a very fast motion, and again, it always seems to, hunt just a little bit. It just seems to overshoot the focus and come back. It's not going like back and forth like the old autofocus systems, but it's definitely that you could see it with the focus breathing that the camera's doing that. Now let's take a look at IBIS. I'm hand holding the camera with an 80mm lens with no IBIS and no assistance. As you can see, this has that telltale high frequency shake associated with the smaller cameras as opposed to a full weight cinema camera. Now in this take, I've enabled IBIS. Everything's the same, simply hand holding. And as you can see, it really kind of ironed out those high frequency shakes. And now in addition to IBIS, I'm adding boost. So it's IBIS plus boost. And finally, I have IBIS plus boost plus the digital image stabilization. It is a slight punch in, as you can see, and this is the result. Now we're going to do a simple handheld walking shot with the lens set at 23mm and no IBIS. Again, you can see those high frequency shakes that are all too common with small cameras. Here's the same walk, 23mm with IBIS. And here we are with IBIS plus digital image stabilization. And now we're walking with IBIS plus boost and digital image stabilization. IBIS for motion work, I thought was a little bit of a mixed bag. Now, if you're trying to be a tripod, just hold very still with a long lens, say, IBIS work great. If you're moving, if you're panning, if you're walking, IBIS does help filter out some of that high frequency shake that you get with the small cameras. But at the same time, especially when I'm not walking, I'm just simply panning. This was actually for a shot that I took for a client that unfortunately I can't share. I was a little surprised that there was a little bit of erratic motion in the shot. And that's, really what you're trying to eliminate with IBIS. And the camera does seem to at times, introduce some additional motion or some unexpected motion. So for those reasons, I would probably not use IBIS most of the time unless I was trying to be a tripod. At least that's my feeling initially and from a couple of shoots in the field. So one of the first tests I'm going to do is actually the battery test because the first shot that I used this camera was for a webcast. Now this camera was going to be unmanned. It had to be capable of recording up to several hours of video nonstop. And I did, of course, use a Atomos Ninja 5 recorder with it because of the 30-minute time limit that, that these cameras have. So let's take a look at battery life and see what we're getting into. This is my setup for the battery test. Of course, the camera running. I have a Ninja recorder attached to it to see what happens once I do lose power. And of course, the clock. So the significant things that I've learned on this test is that this battery that I tested, one battery with a fresh charge, lasted about 92 minutes recording 4K with IBIS on. The second thing I learned is that when the camera loses power, the file does close out, so your data is safe. And finally, if your HDMI trigger is off, the recorder will shut off when the camera loses power. So these things I needed to confirm for myself, and I have. For my last battery test, I have the camera on, but it is not recording, and I'm going out to a Ninja recorder to see how long the camera will last, set up like this. Looks like we went about 109 minutes, about 17 minutes longer recording externally. Now, when it comes to battery power, I like to have enough batteries to get me through most of the day, if not all of the day. Now, with the webcast that I talked about earlier, I ended up going with this solution, and that was the ubiquitous Sony NPF style battery with the battery plate bolted to a Manfrotto long camera plate, and of course the USB-C power cable. This got me through the webcast with no trouble, and it worked fine. But as you can imagine, in the field, this would be cumbersome at best. So what I did, of course, was pick up Fuji's XT4 battery grip. That'll go on just like that. Now with this grip, it takes 2 additional camera batteries, and they do discharge sequentially. And you can see the information on the LCD or in the viewfinder. And with this setup, this will power the camera for, at least half a day without changing batteries, which of course is great. Now, the other little drawback I had with just the camera as is, without the extra battery grip, is battery access. Because most of the time I'm working off a tripod, and when this camera's on a tripod, the battery door is not accessible without removing the camera from the tripod. Now, the truth of the matter, it's not really, that much of a problem or a hassle to take the camera off the tripod, but it is also a hassle. And with the battery grip on the tripod, this of course is side loading, so at any time you need to change batteries, just pull it out, put in new batteries, put it in. You don't have to change your rig, you don't have to de-rig. It just makes a lot of sense for me, and that's how I prefer to work. And of course, going half a day or longer with just the batteries without even changing the battery packs is a great thing. It does give us opportunities to charge batteries. And if I have a couple of extra batteries with me in addition to what's here, I could get through, most of the day if I manage power correctly. Now we'll look at field of view at different resolutions and frame rates. Luckily, between Ultra HD and Full HD at the 16:9 aspect ratio, our field of view was the same. And as we go through some of the options like having IBIS, it really doesn't change. We go to IBIS Boost, it doesn't change. However, when we go to digital image stabilization, it does, of course, crop in a little bit. And once again, the field of view is the same in Ultra HD as it was for HD with these different options. And at different frame rates, so for example, once we get to 120, 240 frames per second, the camera again does crop in quite a bit at a 1.29 crop factor. Fuji implemented a tool, the fixed movie crop magnification, and that keeps that at a constant field of view. If you are going between different settings, that will change the field of view. So it is an option if it is critical for your work. Now, Fuji does give us the ability to keep an eye on the crop factor right here in the top left corner. Now, it is, of course, very convenient to have this, but as you can imagine, this information is also easily lost when you're in the heat of production. Let's take a break and go outside to look at some high-speed work and rolling shutter. Here's a shot of our dog at 23.98 frames per second, going after a stream of water. And now we're looking at our little puppy at 240 frames per second. I see that the sun did hide behind a cloud, but you begin to get an idea of a completely in-camera effect with the pretty much in-camera color. I did not color this shot. Here's my anecdotal look at rolling shutter. First, we're at Ultra HD 4K, and now we are at 1080, looking at rolling shutter. Now, HD looks pretty good, and 4K looks, well, pretty average with rolling shutter. This is a setup for a quick audio test on the XT4. Now, I'm going to record audio on a couple different devices. First, I'll record audio directly onto the XT4, going from a lavalier to a wireless transmitter to the XT4. And what I'll do is I will simply read a passage from Patrick Rothfuss's book, in the Name of the Wind. And then I will read the same passage, but recording directly to a sound device's MixPre 6. And then I'll kind of go side by side to listen to the quality difference between those two recordings. And after that, I will do another side-by-side recording where I'll record the audio to the sound devices and to the XT4 simultaneously. I'll simply take a line level out from the sound devices, going line level in to the XT4. And then I will do another side-by-side comparison to see if, again, we have a good clean signal if we were going from the MixPre 6 to the XT4, if that's a good, clean, usable signal. And this is typically how I would actually work. Now our XT4 is basically set up as an audio recorder. I'm going from the wireless receiver directly into camera at a mic level input, and I believe a minus 4.5 dB. So let's read the passage. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. Now, I'm not sure how the audio is going to sound on your listening device, between, compressing the video for YouTube, and then, of course, sending it to YouTube, having it compressed again. But on my end, in the editing room, or on the editing computer, I could hear a huge difference between the audio recorded directly onto the MixPre 6 versus the audio recorded directly into camera. Basically, I'd have to say that the audio into the recorder is just much fuller bodied, much deeper in tone, more nuanced in tone. It just sounded tinny going directly into the camera. So now let's reconfigure and let's go to the recorder and take a line level out from the recorder into the camera and take a listen. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. So this is actually really surprising. Listening to the 2 recordings on the MixPre 6 versus the XT4, just going line level again from the mixer to the recorder, there was still a very large difference in sound quality. It just sounds better on the sound devices compared to in camera. And I was actually quite surprised because, again, feeding directly from the recorder to the camera at a line level, I kind of expected the sound to sound better, but it sounded very similar to recording directly in camera. Now at this point, I do conclude that I'm always going to want to use a separate audio recorder with this camera. This is a photo of the XT4 on an actual shoot. This was actually a Food Network show that I DP'd, and this is a perfect example of how I would expect or want to integrate one of these cameras into my workflow. And it's also another example of how I would typically accessorize these cameras. So let's take a look at that. This is the typical build out of the XT4 while I've had it. Now, with a smaller camera like this, I really don't want to end up building them out with rails and mat boxes and battery plates in the back, because that more or less defeats the purpose of this small camera. I mean, if we need a cinema camera, let's just rent a cinema camera. So this is the main accessory groups that I use. Of course, the battery pack. And again, with this, it's actually a number of reasons for the battery pack. For one, for me, it's actually more comfortable to hold the camera if I'm going to hand hold it, to have the extra grip over here and the size and the weight of the battery pack. It just happens to fit my hand a little bit better. Of course, the main thing for the battery pack is the battery life. Again, to have almost 4 hours of power is a great thing. And of course, because the single battery loads from the bottom, and I often have to remove it from the tripod, and I'm a stabilized guy, the battery pack is side loading. We do not have to remove this from a tripod or from a rig to change the batteries. So this is a huge accessory. The cage, as you can see, I'm running a small rig cage on this that's designed to work in conjunction with the battery pack. And the cage is really here for this. This is the connector, the cable lock, the HDMI cable lock, and the USB-C cable lock. For me, if I'm going to record to the Atomos, I absolutely want to have the cable locked in place because a micro HDMI cable, I mean, it's just so small. The chances of that moving around, getting, popping out, bending, damaging the connector is pretty good. So I always like to use a cable lock if I'm going to use HDMI cables. That, of course, goes to the Atomos recorder, the Ninja 5. And on the bottom here, I'm using a simple NATO rail, again from Small Rig. And in conjunction with that, again, another Small Rig piece, and that has the NATO adapter on top. And on the bottom, it's a 3/8 screw, along with 2 of the ARRI locating pins, which goes right on top here. Just plop on that. It'll prevent it from twisting. And the last accessory, of course, was this simple wired remote to trigger the camera, as you saw on the jib arm. We had the remote just hanging because it's actually it's a pretty short lead on the remote. It just connects in here with a simple barrel connector, and we could start and stop the camera. So when it's up in the sky, instead of trying to find this trigger, simply hit the wired remote and it starts to stop the camera. Now there is an app. I've downloaded, I've tried to use it a number of occasions. I have not been successful with the app from Fujifilm. It always seems to be disconnecting. It doesn't recognize a camera. I always have to reinstall it. And then when it does install, half the time or more than half the time, I can't get it to start and stop the camera. So I pretty much abandoned the app. And by the reviews, I'm obviously not alone in my feeling and experience with that app. So hopefully Fujifilm will be able to update that pretty soon. So that pretty much describes the accessories and the build-out I have with this camera. Now in this video, I'm not going to get into all the film simulations or picture profiles or F-log that's available with this camera because those are long and involved subjects, and they're long videos unto themselves. And I think that this video at this point is already probably too long. So I'm just going to jump to the conclusion with what we've tested so far. The real question, okay. Will this camera fit into my workflow or my professional workflow? And the answer is, the short answer is, I don't think it will. And it's not the fault of the XT4. It's just everything inherent in working with this mirrorless form factor compared to working with full-fledged cinema cameras. And I know it's not fair to say that because to expect this to be, an Alexa Mini LF is really not fair. But of course, we're always hopeful. We're hopeful that the things that these cameras have can really aid us. And in this case, I will say autofocus. That's one thing that I think it's going to be used very often professionally in the near future, or actually right now with some of the current cameras. My feeling is the autofocus on the XT4 is not something that I would use. The motion doesn't feel organic. It still feels very mechanical, especially on a big focus rack. If the subject's just still, like, in an interview, it'll be fine. But if subject's walking back and forth, or worst case scenario, we are racking focus, it's just not aesthetically pleasing. And so I probably will not use it. IBIS. Apparently the big thing with the XT4 was the introduction of IBIS. And, from my test and my experience in the field, if I'm walking, if I'm panning, I would disable IBIS. It does help a little bit, not a lot. And I do feel that IBIS does introduce its own erratic motion on occasion, on rare occasion. Doesn't do it all the time. Now, if you're being a human tripod and have a long lens and I'm just trying to get it as steady as possible, IBIS actually works great. I do think it's designed for still photography. It's not designed for motion work. And for the most part, though, I would probably disable IBIS. Now, as far as working with the camera in the field, the ergonomics, the menu system. The menu system is on its own with Fuji. To me, it's not particularly intuitive, and it's not just myself. I know when ACs have to get a hold of the camera, if they're not familiar with the Fuji menu system, they very quickly get lost. They're constantly asking, where can I find this? Where can I find that? Because again, we're used to the Arri, Canon, Sony, their cinema cameras. We're used to that menu structure, and they are all different. And we're kind of used to it. We're used to things being placed in certain areas, and Fuji does seem to place things, in different parts of the menu. So that's a little bit of a drawback because again, using this for work, you constantly work with different crews. If the camera's not familiar to people, that is a slight drawback. Now, other things like battery life. Again, with this battery pack, this can go for half a day, and that's phenomenal. These small cameras definitely are very efficient with power, relative to a cinema camera, and that's a great thing. It's one of the great things about them. And another thing about ergonomics with these cameras is apparently these Fujis have IBIS rings, and to an old timer like me, I mean, that was when I first found that out. I was ecstatic. I was like, wow, this is great. Like all the Fuji lenses seem to have IBIS rings. And I wish all cameras still retained IBIS rings, but as we know, many of them do not. So that's a definite plus for the Fuji. The X mount. More and more lenses are available on X mount, in particular some of the manual cinema style lenses. So that seems to be developing nicely. You can, of course, get a lens adapter if you want to go to EF mount or PL mount. They are all available for the X mount. Those are all good things. But as far as using the camera the way that I intended, I'm just finding that some of the areas that I really expected it to be strong or very helpful to me are not quite there yet. And it's for this reason I'm probably going to move this along and, try some of the full frame variants, the A7 S3, maybe the S1H, maybe some of the Canons, or maybe even some of the Nikons, and see how well those cameras can work into my workflow. So hopefully I'll be able to test some of those cameras in the near future and then post them here. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you down the road.